Reading 75 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 3. Great Animal House, April 29th, 1947. Further note on psychological thinking. Let us try to understand again what the work means by psychological thinking and find examples. In his introduction to his last book, O says that logically, machine guns are excellent, but psychologically, they are wrong. Nowadays, we might easily apply this idea to atom bombs. Logically, they are excellent for totally annihilating the enemy, but psychologically, they are all wrong. Now, what does this mean? Can you see what is meant? Let us reflect. Today, war is openly avowed to be total. Everything that remains human and decent in war, we are told, must be eliminated. Total war is total destruction without mercy or pity. Logically, this is an excellent argument. If they say you are going to have war, let it be total war. Let us invent machines by our logical science that will, at one instant, destroy a continent. And some add that this is the only way to end war. Now, one object of the work is to teach us psychological thinking. And one out of many aspects of the teaching in this respect is about external considering. Let us think about what external considering means. It means, in a word, putting yourself in the position of another person. In the Gospels, it is called love of neighbor, a phrase perhaps which does not today conduct much meaning, but which, if properly translated, would mean be conscious of your neighbor. For what is translated as love is very close to the supreme idea of this work, namely, to become more conscious, to enlarge our consciousness, in fact, to become conscious man. The conscious circle of humanity, as the work terms it, is composed of people who, in comparison with us, are fully conscious. To be fully conscious implies, amongst many things, to be conscious of oneself and of the other person. External considering means to be conscious in the other person, to put your consciousness, so to speak, into the other person, so that you see from him what he feels about you. That is, you can see, let us say, why he dislikes you. But that is impossible unless you have become conscious of yourself. By that means one sees oneself in others and others in oneself. This ends violence, and so it ends mass killing by machines. O once said that machines make war. He said it is as if they insist on being used, and man, being asleep and having no real will, has to obey their will to be used. The idea is worth thinking about. That is, if you have any time to think for yourself in the increasingly hurried stress of life. The idea, of course, belongs to the great idea of the work that man himself is a machine and can do nothing unless he reaches a higher level of consciousness and comes under better influences, and so is helped. Now, to put yourself completely in another person's situation with conscious knowledge of yourself as a starting point is one example of thinking psychologically. You will lay aside the machine guns. Violence only breeds violence. Consciousness takes away the desire for violence, for how can you be violent with, as it were, yourself? That is, when you recognize that the other person is yourself and has the same fears and pain. This is by way of commentary, and I put as an example of psychological thinking based on this remark of O, that the use of machine guns is no doubt right on the logical level, but does not belong to the level of psychological thinking, and is not right on that level. That is, a man who thinks on the psychological level cannot use them, just like that, or any other mass-destructive machinery. Now, no psychological thinking is possible if there is no belief in greater mind. Let us put the different categories of thinking on the board again, one below another. First comes greater mind. This mind is beyond our mind. It thinks not only differently, but in an entirely different way. Now we can guess one way it thinks, namely, it thinks always relatively. That is, when we, with our scarcely conscious minds, think of one thing, of a thing, separate from anything else, greater mind thinks of that one thing in relation to the whole thing of which it is a part. Now, our thinking, to take one example, can scarcely get beyond our national country. The existence of the world as a whole, of which our country is a small part, and of our country as a small part of the whole world, does not enter consciousness as a sine qua non of even beginning to think rightly in this respect. In relative thinking, O said, it is necessary to know something of the whole before one can think rightly of the part. This is the right definition of relative thinking, and it is what I mean when I speak of relative thinking to you. He added that only a little may be known of the whole, and far more of the part, but that unless the two were thought of in relation to one another, the thinking would be wrong. He observed that we live in a related universe, a universe in which everything is related with everything else, and everything influences everything else, and nothing can be taken separately, isolated from the rest. It is just the same, he said, with the body. Not a single part of the body is isolated, a thing by itself. To understand a small part of the body, such as the thumb, something must be known of the whole body, and the part thought of in relation to the whole. First, the thumb has to be thought of in relation to the hand, and to the 4 fingers, which are useless without the thumb, and so to the arm, etc. We can therefore be sure that greater mind, although its mode of thinking is quite different from ours, and it is another kind of mind altogether, always thinks relatively, and that to it, everything is seen to be related to everything else. And again, we may be sure that greater mind, thinking relatively, can be conscious in all 3 forces, and certainly in second force, and calculate when and how it will appear if such and such a thing is done. Many things, therefore, that mechanical man reacts to without consciousness must appear sheer insanity to greater mind. In short, our wisdom must appear sheer folly. So it is said in sacred writings, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God." God meaning greater mind. Now we shall speak for a moment of higher centers and greater mind, and fully conscious man together. You have heard that the language of higher centers is not logical language, because it has 3 forces in it and cannot be understood at the logical level. The ideas of higher centers do not fall on lower centers, but are altered. This is one reason why C influences coming direct from higher centers or conscious man are inevitably distorted in passing into life, and so become B influences. Think about this for yourselves and see why this must be so. Higher centers do not think in terms of yes or no. They do not think from opposites, as does the formatory or logical mind. Their range of thinking is of another order, in which there are no contradictions. To make contact with greater mind, a man must understand that his logical formatory thinking will prevent him. A logical man cannot understand this work. He must jump from that formatory, arguing level and catch the rope suspended above his head. He must first begin to distinguish between psychological meaning and logical meaning. For example, when it says in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," the logical thinking takes this as literal bread, but it does not mean literal bread. Notice that the prayer begins with the idea of greater mind, namely, our Father in heaven. The bread prayed for is meaning from greater mind. In the Greek, the word translated as daily is a word not used anywhere else, which has nothing to do with the baker delivering bread every day. Now, if a person begins to see the world and himself in the light of esoteric teaching, that is, in the light of this work, he begins to awaken. Then he prays for that which will help him to awaken and keep him awake daily. Now you understand that in the above example, logical, literal thinking will take bread as bread. If there be a God, it is surely perfectly logical to ask him for daily physical bread. The point is that the prayer does not mean this. It means something on a different level that can only be understood by psychological thinking, and you will see that it is all connected with the general idea of the ray of creation, of greater mind, of the conscious circle of humanity, of man awakening and getting in touch with higher forces that will help him to undergo his destined internal development. In other words, praying for this so-called daily bread means praying for the force, the influences that will enable the spirit of man to awaken and open his eyes and stand upright on his feet on this earth where everyone is asleep and spiritually horizontal, and yet imagines he can do. That implies that he imagines he knows what right and wrong is and can ensure it. I will end this brief commentary by saying that another example of psychological thinking is concealed in this statement. Whatever keeps you awake is right. Whatever puts you to sleep is wrong. This gives a new idea of right and wrong, a psychological idea, not a literal one.